So as we wait for folks to join, or as folks are joining, I will welcome you again. My name is Professor Rebecca Todd Peters, Toddy Peters. I'm in the Religious Studies Department. I'm a professor of ethics. And we are gathering together this evening for a lecture titled, or a conversation really, Reckoning with the Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, a conversation with Robert P. Jones. And we are grateful to a number of co-sponsors for this event. The Center for the Study of Religion, Culture, and Society, the Religious Studies Department, the Poverty and Social Justice Program, which I also direct, the CREED, the African American Studies Program, CORE, and the Bringing Theory to Practice program at Elon. We are all delighted to join together to co-sponsor this conversation with Robert P. Jones. And I would like to introduce Robbie to our audience. Robert P. Jones is the CEO and founder of PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, and he is a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He's the author of White Too Long. His latest book came out recently. The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity and the End of White Christian America. His last book, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion, which is one of the biggest awards in the field of religious studies. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic Online, NBC Think, and other outlets. He's frequently featured in major national media such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Jones serves on the National Program Committee for the American Academy of Religion and is a past member of the editorial boards for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and Politics and Religion, a journal of the American Political Science Association. Robbie holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and an MDiv degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And his undergraduate alma mater is Mississippi College. We are delighted to have you here with us tonight. The format for this evening is Dr. Jones is going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes to get us started about the work that he's doing in this area. And then Damian Blake, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Policy Studies, as well as being the Faculty Fellow for the CREED, will, hi Damian, thank you. Damian and I will come back on screen and we will have a conversation with Dr. Jones. And then for the last 20 minutes, Dr. Buffy Longmire-Avital, Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of ACE, is going to come back and join us, and she's going to share questions that we have been collecting from students for the last 20 minutes. So welcome, and we're glad that you're here. And Robbie, we will look forward to what you have to say to get us started. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Professor Peters, and thanks to Elon and all the co-sponsors for making this possible. I'm really thrilled to be here. I wish that I were there in person to see you all, as I'm sure many of you wish there were many more available events in person. So I'm feeling it along with everyone else, but we'll see. We'll do our best to have a conversation and to cover the ground tonight. So, I want to start really with really going to the heart of the matter of the book. So, I titled the book, this new book, White Too Long. And that quote comes from James Baldwin, an African-American writer, kind of mid 20th century writer who was writing really from the 50s through the civil rights movement. And it comes from a quote that he wrote just a few months after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And to set this quote up, I should say that that Baldwin was sort of unflinchingly honest, known for kind of really not pulling any punches, but he was also known for being hopeful. I think that at the end of the day, Americans, white Americans, and particularly white Christian Americans, he was deeply formed by his own Christian faith, would ultimately stand up on the right side of the civil rights movement and stand up for racial justice. But he's writing at this quote I'm about to read you at a moment of really despair, I think, because he's just seen Martin Luther King assassinated, Bobby Kennedy's been assassinated, and there isn't this big uprising among white Americans, and particularly white Christian Americans in the country. And so he's writing from this place of deep hurt and disappointment and really despair here. And I want to read it because it was a quote that really has stayed with me as I've been writing, as I wrote the book. And it's kind of one of the reasons why it made it into this title. It is a tough quote to hear if you're white and Christian in particular. But I think it's important for us to hear from him. Then I'm going to kind of move into the book from there. But here's the quote. This is in the New York Times, op-ed in the New York Times, just a few months after Martin Luther King's killing. I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs and an intolerable violation of myself. Now, these are some pretty hard words. And again, I mean, Baldwin was really not one to dip his pen in the well of hatred, and really was hopeful for most of his writing. So this really stands out. And so one way of thinking about the book that I ended up writing and the research that I'm about to lay out is to ask the question, like, so what happens if we who are white and Christian listen to such a hard witness as this? What happens if we look at this in the mirror and instead of walking away, looking away, or dismissing it, we hold the gaze? And there's a passage from H. Richard Niebuhr, is a theologian who was writing about 100 years ago now, and he wrote this book called The Meaning of Revelation. One of the key things he said in there is that there are different ways that God has ongoing revelation to the church, and one of them was kind of internal through the church's own spiritual life and practice and kind of generational changes and all of that. That there were ongoing ways in which God's revelation continued. But the other one that I think hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as it deserves is Niebuhr's hit a concept also of external history. And he said, we need to listen to the voices outside of our churches. And what are they saying about us? How do they see us? And so I think in that spirit, I think taking this very difficult quote and this very difficult, really, indictment, really, of white Americans and white Christian Americans in the wake of the killing of Martin Luther King, and the kind of lack of a great outpouring, and standing up for civil rights for African Americans. Again, what does it look like if we kind of hold that gaze, that uncomfortable, painful gaze? Where does that take us? So in some ways, that's really what I'm up to in the book, is trying to hold that gaze. And I'm doing it, I kind of use three sources in the book. One of them is history. So really trying to tell a kind of repressed and hidden story of the centuries-long entanglement of American Christianity with white supremacy. What does that look like if we really try to uncover that history? The other piece of it is social science, and particularly contemporary public opinion data. So trying to look at what do we see in the contemporary public opinion data that might reflect some of this history still with us today. And then finally, this book, and this is a little bit new for me, I most of the time wear kind of my social scientist hat. But given that I grew up in the Deep South, and I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, and I have a family who goes back 6 generations in Middle Georgia, around Macon, Georgia. This book was also quite personal. So it's really a blend of memoir, social science, and history that tries to tell this truer and fuller story, again, of this entanglement of white supremacy and American Christianity, and really bring it into our present and explain like how the fault lines we're seeing, even in our current moment of racial reckoning in the country, how they're connected really to this history and to this legacy that I think has been mostly ignored. So, the main thesis of the book, comes straightforwardly out of that, and that is this: that most of the time when we think about, if you hear the term civil rights and church, what people think about are the activities in African American churches, right? That served as hubs of organizing and places for kind of replenishing the African American community spirit in the midst of a very tough struggle for civil rights in the 1950s and 60s and the 70s. But what many people don't think about, when they hear the words civil rights and church, is the role that white Christian churches played in resisting that movement. But a close read of history reveals that really we white Christians, and I'm going to talk, when I say we, I'm going to be referring to this group that I consider myself a part of, haven't just been complacent or complicit. I think when we have gotten around to accepting some responsibility, it has been mostly in those terms that we were. It was kind of a sin of omission, really, that we were complacent or complicit. But I think the testimony of history is actually sterner than that. And that is that as the nation's dominant cultural power, we white Christians have actually been responsible for constructing and sustaining a project of perpetuating white supremacy that has framed the entire American story. This has been with us from the founding of the country, and Christianity, again, as this dominant cultural power in the country, has been the most powerful force legitimizing this worldview. And even after the most overt forms of affirming white supremacy, such as slavery, have faded, or overtly supporting overt segregation, for example, has faded over the last generation, what we find is that this legacy of this unholy union still lives in white Christianity today. And as I'll show in a minute, talking about the quantitative piece of this, the kind of quantitative study, that this lives not just among white evangelical Protestants, that sector of Christianity that I'm from, that's anchored in the South, but it lives on among white mainline Protestants who are more populous in the Midwest, and among white Catholics as well, who are more populous in the Northeast and are actually more urban setting. So, if I say a little bit about motivations for writing the book, and then I'm going to set up the social science findings, and then we'll kind of go into a conversation. It is, kind of why this book and why now. And I began really thinking hard about this book really 5 years ago or so, and it was a couple of events. It was the kind of shooting of several African Americans by police back in 2015 and around that time. And it was also the killing of 9 African Americans in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, by Dylan Roof, who was himself everybody talked about him as a kind of white supremacist, but no one really talked that much about Dylan Roof, about his Christian faith. He was in fact a member in good standing at an evangelical Lutheran church there, and very much saw his faith integrated into his white supremacist views. So I think that really set me about thinking how that the fact that this could be so easily incorporated into his worldview, and that we had really not had a great reckoning in white Christian theology and practice for reforming these views that have been cultivated over hundreds of years. So to quote Baldwin one time at the turn here to the social science data that goes to motivation, he was a great line. He said, "Not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So I think one thing I'm up to here is just trying to kind of help hold the mirror up to myself and to my fellow white Christians across the board. Again, not just to evangelicals, but mainline and Catholic Christians as well. And to really have us kind of hold the gaze long enough to think about what it might mean to reckon with this history, so that we walk into a different future and we hand down a different future to our kids. So let me talk a little bit about how this legacy is still with us. I think the history part may not be, in some ways not that surprising, although it has been remarkably suppressed. But I think the contemporary public opinion data is perhaps more surprising. So what I set out to do is to take a look at national public opinion data that looked at issues not just of personal racism, but evidence of kind of how people saw structural racism. So not just personal views, but things that are part of the way that society is set up. Because at the end of the day, white supremacy, and what I mean by white supremacy in the book isn't the thing I think most often people think about. That is, it's people in white sheets burning crosses in people's yards, or throwing bricks, or shooting people. Like it's kind of white Christian extremists, are people like the KKK. But that's not really what I mean. And I'm going to borrow a term here from Princeton professor Eddie Glaude, who both Professor Peters and I know from the American Academy of Religion circles. He's actually a past president of the American Academy of Religion. But he had this great line where he said, the thing that we really need to understand today is what he called white supremacy without all the bluster. And what he means there, and I think what I mean as well, is not the kind of just the violent extremist acts, but the way the society is set up to privilege and to value the lives of white people over others. And I think if we define it that way, that what we see is that for almost all of American history, through prohibiting certain kinds of jobs, certain neighborhoods, and different, as a result of different economic outcomes, different health outcomes, that we can see this is just shot through all of American history, and until the very, very recent past, it was so overt. And even now, right, we can see it in criminal justice kind of patterns of how criminal justice is applied, how policing is applied, and still even the battles we're having over Confederate symbols, for example. So what I set out to do is to kind of measure that sort of thing, that not just kind of personal ill feelings towards someone of a different race, but attitudes around structural racism in the book. I'll give you a couple of examples. One that's right out of the headlines that we've been wrestling with over the summer, and that is the killing of unarmed African Americans by police. And what I did is I kind of looked in the book at white Christians on the one hand, and comparing them to other whites, that is, whites who are not Christian and who claim no religious affiliation, and then looking at where those groups are in relationship to the attitudes of African Americans. So, for example, if I just look at these two groups, white Christians overall are about 25 percentage points more likely than religiously unaffiliated whites, that is, whites who are not Christian, to say the killing of unarmed African Americans by police are isolated incidents, rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. That is, they don't connect the dots in any structural way that would say this is a pattern and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. So again, white Christians, 25 percentage points more likely than religiously unaffiliated whites to say the killing of unarmed African Americans by police are isolated incidents. On a different question, on the Confederate flag, for example, again, same pattern. White Christians are at least 30 percentage points more likely, again, than religiously unaffiliated whites to say the Confederate flag is more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism. And I used a number of questions like this. In fact, there are 15 different questions I use in the book that go around, that cover quite a lot of ground: attitudes about Confederate symbols, attitudes around African-American, limits to African-American economic mobility, the treatment of African Americans in the criminal justice system and by police, and then questions around the general perceptions of race, racism, and racial discrimination. And what was remarkable is that the attitudes in all 15 of these questions hold together quite well, which tells you that these questions are actually measuring kind of a consistent attitude or worldview kind of behind these 15 different questions. So in the book, what I did is I combined all these questions into one big index I called the Racism Index. And then I would use that composite measure of attitudes across all of these questions. And they show the same patterns over and over, but it's kind of more powerful because it really is a composite measure and rather than just single attitudes. And here's what it showed. That basically when compared to non-religious whites, white Christians overall registered higher median scores on the Racism Index. And perhaps, so I scored it 1 to 10, with 1 being holding the least racist views, 8 and 10 holding the most racist views. And it may not be that surprising to find out that white evangelical Protestants scored 8 out of 10 on this index. But what's maybe more surprising is that white mainline Protestants, again, kind of more Midwestern constituency, and white Catholics, a more Northeastern constituency, scored 7 out of 10 on this index. So again, clustered together, white Christians clustered together at the high end of the scale, 7 or 8, And then whites who are religiously unaffiliated only scored 4 out of 10, much closer to where African Americans are. They're down at 2 out of 10. So if you ask the question, like, who is closer to the concerns, to the worries of African Americans, it's not whites who are Christian, it's whites who are religiously unaffiliated, whites who are not Christian. And it turns out that this relationship is quite robust, that even when I controlled for a whole range of things like being Republican, education levels, gender, region, urban, rural, all these kinds of things that might be alternative explanations for why white Christians are here and whites who are not Christian are here, it turns out that none of those things change the patterns. And so what that tells you is that it really is Christian identity that is doing the work here, that really is the separator between whites, and that move, you take your average white, and basically the research says this: if you take your average white person and you add Christianity, they move higher on the racism index rather than lower. It turns out that the relationship is so robust, you could do it in both directions. If you kind of run the analysis the other way and you sort of start and you say, look, that it turns out that being affiliated with a white Christian group, even holding all other attributes of a person equal, is independently associated with about a 10% increase in racist attitudes. And if you look at that relationship that way among religiously unaffiliated whites, there's no relationship there. So it again, the Christianity, I think, is doing some work. And then the last thing I'll kind of point to on the before I kind of close on the statistical models, the other thing that I think was really perhaps just shocking was that when I looked at the role of religious attendance, so because one objection might be, well, okay, this relationship is there, but perhaps it's just because these are Christians in name only. In other words, they don't go to church, they haven't been a part of a discipleship program or a Sunday school program, or they're not hearing sermons on a regular basis. And even when I looked at the relationship between those who attend more often and not, at best, among all white Christians, it makes no difference. In other words, the strength of the relationship between being a white Christian and holding more racist attitudes doesn't diminish. And among white evangelicals, again, the group that I grew up in, there is an effect, but it's in the negative direction. That is that what we find is the strength of the relationship between holding racist views and identifying as a white evangelical is actually stronger among more frequent church attenders than among less frequent church attenders. So if we're asking whether church attendance mitigates racism, what the data points to is that among all white Christians, no, it does not. And among white evangelicals, in fact, it looks like it may make things, in fact, worse in terms of holding less racist views. So I'm going to kind of conclude. I mean, in the book, I touch on theology, I touch on history. Maybe we can come to some of that in the discussions. But I'll kind of just close with a couple of thoughts. I do think that we're clearly at a crossroads on racial justice. That I do think 2020 is kind of putting things on the table that have certainly always been there, but they're out there on the table in a way they haven't been. And we have a real opportunity, I think, to take advantage of this moment of reckoning here. And that there is, and I highlight some communities at the end of the book that are doing some of this hard work of reckoning and finding that there is a path here for healing, for reconciliation. But importantly, the lesson learned, I think, from those communities, we can talk about more about this later too, is that there is not a kind of straight line from where we are to reconciliation that does not go through what I've called the valley of repair and justice. Like the questions of repairing the damage can't be skipped if we really want anything like true reconciliation, or to put it theologically, anything like true repentance. Does require us thinking about what does it mean to repair this damage that's been done. And I think there is some hopefulness here. I can talk about that again in the Q&A. But I think we've seen even in the last few months that some of the protests for racial justice have indeed changed the conversation in a way that was different from even when I turned in the manuscript for this book a year ago. I think the landscape is different, and these conversations are happening. I mean, just the word white supremacy wasn't uttered very much in white Christian circles even a year ago. And that conversation, I think, is happening today. So I'll close with these thoughts. I do think the question is being called, and in a way that perhaps it hasn't been called so straightforwardly for white Christians in perhaps a generation. As that question is being called, there is, to kind of borrow some biblical language, a great cloud of witnesses gathering to see whether we white Christians are going to finally find the humility and the courage and the love to face the truth about our long relationship with white supremacy. And as we're seeing some of these monuments to white supremacy falling in the landscape, the question for us is whether we'll take the lead in dismantling the white supremacist worldview and theologies that we legitimize to erect those things in the first place. And I'm going to tip my hat again to Baldwin. Kind of began with him. I'm going to end with him. That a little more hopeful quote from him that I think is right, and something I'm kind of holding on to, even in the midst of this division in our country today. And he said this: if we can muster the humility and courage and love to tell the truth, we just might end the racial nightmare, achieve our country, and change the history of the world. That was written 50 years ago, but in the fire next time. But it could have easily been written this morning.
All right, thank you so much. I would like to welcome Dr. Damian Blake back with us. I'm Dr. Toddy Peters from the Religious Studies Department. Dr. Blake is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Policy Studies. Dr. Blake and I are going to have a conversation with Dr. Jones for a few minutes. So Damian, do you want to get us started?
Sure. And thanks again, Dr. Jones, for your incredible and very timely talk, on the intersection of Christianity and white supremacy. As I read your book and listened to your talk, I see your personal and professional reckoning and engagement with the tentacles of white supremacy in the Christian faith. You have identified the complacency, really, Christianity has had with white supremacy. And in turn, white supremacy, has wreaked damages on the faith and believers, and also on the democratic process, progress, and potentials of the nation. And so my question then is, how can Southern Christians and Christians across the country and the church really come to terms with and confront and perhaps even challenge the white supremacist features of Christianity? Because I think these things are tied to anti-racist activism, which is really needed at this moment in American body politic, even questions around reparations and racial justice.
Yeah, it's challenging, right? It's challenging because it's difficult to face, I think, a difficult history. But one of the things that I think I've become clearer on, and part of this has come from really reading African-American authors and talking to, African-American colleagues, is this reminder. King was so clear about this. Frederick Douglass was clear about this. James Baldwin was clear about this. And I think the best of our, kind of even white, white Christian theologians that have been clear about this too, that, when one group oppresses another group, it very clearly does damage to the group who is being oppressed. But what the oppressing group often forgets is the damage that it does to oneself to oppress someone else, right? So if we think hard about, what does it take? What kind of maneuvering? What kind of distortions does it require? For example, I'll take this to make this very concrete. So the parent church of the church that was kind of the parent church of my parents' church in Macon, Georgia, began its life in 1820. When it was founded by a group of stalwart Baptists, white Baptists, who were not all of them, but the bulk of the founders of that church were slave owners. And the way church looked, if you had just kind of drifted in on a Sunday morning or been a fly on the wall on a Sunday morning in the 1820s, what you would have seen is whites who were plantation owners and enslaving other people sitting in the front portion of the church, and enslaved Africans sitting in the back portion of the church, all hearing one sermon, singing the same hymns, practicing the same practices. Now, if you kind of sit with that long enough and you say, okay, well, what kind of Christianity could get practiced in that context, right? It begins to sit with you how real this challenge was. That this is in many cases was the seedbed of early American Christianity. Was this outright tolerance and justification for owning other human beings based on the color of their skin and legitimizing it with Christian principles. I mean, this was straight out there and very open, very in front, and wasn't contested that heartily until leading up to the Civil War, and it became then a highly contested thing. But I think taking that history seriously, I think is what is so clear, and also noting that slavery, the question of slavery and the question of white supremacy are two different things. And Frederick Douglass was like really super clear about this, that he was dismayed that even when the question of slavery got solved, which had split every Protestant denomination, major Protestant denomination. I should emphasize this too. This is not just a Baptist story, right? The Methodist split, the Presbyterian split, the Lutheran split, the Episcopalian split. I mean, every major Protestant denomination split over the issue of slavery in this country. So it's not just one, there's not one, it's kind of a macro Christian issue here. So they all split, and then it took them various times to come back together. But one of the things that Douglass was dismayed about is that even though they disagreed on the issue of slavery, where they did not disagree was on the issue of white supremacy. And that is that the view that was most widely shared was that whites were still a superior race, that were meant to be at the top of the social and cultural and political pyramid, and that this was essentially God's will, right, for civilizing the country. And so it's a real, I think it's a real challenge, because that's the bedrock on which white American Christianity was built. And we've kind of shifted, evolved, but there's never really been a kind of serious moment of reckoning to kind of weed out, the kind of that beginning.
Thanks. I'm going to shift us a little bit to thinking about at least one of your primary audiences is clearly white Christians. And that is a group of people who are likely to be either supremely disinterested in talking about this topic or very uncomfortable with the things that you're raising. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how you hope to reach into the communities that you would like to be in dialogue with and bring them into this conversation?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say, I think it's really important that this book is written by somebody who looks like me, right, and who has the history that I have, right, kind of rooted in Southern evangelical religion, with this long family, his 6 generations of history back. So I think that's important. The other thing is, I've tried to write this book. One reason why I decided to write it as part memoir and to tell some of my own family's history is as an invitation to a conversation, right? And this is not a finger wagging book. The first sentence in the book has the word I in it. The last sentence in the book has the word us in it. I mean, I'm writing about a journey that I've been on, and I'm hopefully, inviting other people to come along with me. But what I think at the heart of it is motivating me. This is also not a church hating book, right? I mean, if I had really was ready to write off the church, I mean, I really wouldn't have spent the time writing this book. It wouldn't have been worth my while. I get other fish to fry. But I think I wrote it out of deep concern and love for the church, right, and for it to be its best self, and to kind of call it to account for for us again, so missing the mark on race time after time after time. And finally, kind of saying, okay, let's try to get it right on race. Let's not kick the can down the road. And the other thing to say is that when I think about, I think we're often we get caught up. I think we white Christians get caught up in a kind of defending our heritage. You hear that language, defending our ancestors, and that's one way of looking at it that kind of throws up a defensive barrier, right? I think that's just there, and we all got to acknowledge that. But I think the other, we often forget that we've got to turn the other direction too, right? I mean, history, we're ultimately going to be somebody else's ancestor, right? And history is a long chain of being. And so, yes, we've inherited things from our past, but, really the job of being faithful, to kind of use another, kind of Christian theological word, is to take what we've received from our past, evaluate it as best we can, and try to hand something better to our kids, right? So if we're thinking not just 2 generations or 3 generations back, but 2 to 3 generations forward, the picture looks very different. And our task and our responsibility really is about healing. It's really about healing a faith that's been distorted and diseased, and trying to bring it to health. And we do that for ourselves. Certainly, we do it for our own responsibility here while we are here on the earth. But we also do it because if we don't, we're going to hand this problem down to our kids and our grandchildren, right? And we're going to hand this kind of a distorted, disfigured version of the faith down. And so I think there's actually some great pride that can be taken in being the generation that finally says, all right, we're going to take responsibility. We are going to face this very difficult history, and we're going to do it in the name of the faith that we want to hand down to our kids.
Yes, that's really helpful to follow up on that, and to bring you back to something you were talking about a few minutes ago. What does that look like? You talked about repair and justice. How do you imagine that? What kind of repair needs to happen? What does justice look like? What is your obviously this is something that people need to create together moving forward, but how do you imagine that, or what do you think about those?
Yeah. Well, I think we get into trouble when we start having these conversations in the abstract, right? That I think it really does have to be an embodied local conversation first. That's the reason why at the end of the book, there was some pressure, I think, on me with my editor and some other folks. Not hard pressure, but just why don't you end the book with kind of a 10-step program that churches can do to kind of take themselves from point A to point B. And I really resisted that push, mostly because I have 2 things. To be honest, I don't have a 10-step program. I could make one up, but it's not something that I really have. Nor do I think anyone has that program. And we're talking about something that has been built in over generations, right? And it's going to take at least a generation to really move it back the other way. And I think it's going to have to be built out of lived experience in the churches. So that's why I kind of go down to a case study, for example, of 2 Baptist churches in Macon, one predominantly white, one predominantly black, and they actually were both part of that church I described earlier in the conversation. They came out of that same context, but then have been sitting around the corner for each other, sharing the same name, First Baptist Church of Macon, right there around the corner from each other, not really interacting at all. And I think the real place that is that I've seen where I'm looking at kind of things that are hopeful is the 2 pastors of those churches finally said, what are we doing? Why are we ignoring each other? We should be in community with one another. They're not trying to merge the churches. They're not, trying to do that, but they are trying to build relationships between the 2 churches. And that has actually been quite transformational, right? So the white church has kind of had its own work to do, reckoning with its own history, finding, for example, that at one time in the church's life, before the Civil War, when the church was having trouble paying its bills, paying for the building, and paying the pastor, one of the ways they balanced the books is that they sold members of their own church to balance the books, right? That's one, and facing that history and saying, again, amid all the great stuff we like to point to that we've done in this community, this is also us, right? And really sitting with that, and what do we do with that, and how was it that our progenitors thought that was anywhere near okay, right? And felt okay about that, and what does that mean for us today? But I also think it's been a place of healing for that church and change. And so when things like when Trayvon Martin was shot, and when those 9 worshipers at Mother Emanuel AME were shot, the pastor of the white church said to me when I talked to him, he said, look, had we not been in a relationship with this other church, I'd like to think this would have been on our minds, central, that we would have stood up, we would have shown up for this other church. But I'm not sure we would have. But because they had relationships there, he said it wasn't even a conversation. Like, we knew we had to show up because these are people who we have relationships with. So I think that's it. And I think that if things like conversation around reparations, which is, comes from this word repair. I think reparations become such a political football that we forget that it comes from repentance and repair, right? That's where the roots of that word come from. Those become less thorny questions when you can look someone in the eye and it's somebody you have a relationship with, right? It really becomes a question of love at the end of the day, right? Justice and love converge in some ways that are really important. So, I think done right, what this ends up with is that what it's really a call for is pretty simple, really. And we can make it really complicated and all of that. But I think at the end of the day, it boils down to a call for white Christians to do two things. One is to tell the truth and to bear witness to the truth, all of it, the good, the bad, and to love our neighbors, right? And that has to include people outside of our stained glass windows and outside of our racial group. And if we're able to do that, all of this other stuff, I think that feels the defensiveness, I think, is the biggest thing that drops, right? When it's motivated by love and relationship, these questions have a really different resonance than they do when they're just abstract.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There's so many more questions, but I would like to invite Dr. Buffy Longmire-Avital to come back and join us. Dr. Longmire-Avital is professor of psychology and is the director of ACE, the African American Studies program at Elon. And we have been collecting questions from students. And so we really want to make sure we have lots of time for our student questions. So I'm going to turn this over to Buffy, and she and Robbie are going to have some conversation. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for your remarks and for the conversation so far, as well as our opportunity to talk earlier today. So a number of these questions you have kind of touched upon in some way. So kind of going through and seeing what we have. But I wanted to start with a first question from a student. First name was Will. And he said, with heightened racial tensions across American society, particularly after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery this past summer, how can the teachings of Christianity move not just white Americans, but white individuals globally in a direction to address achieving true equity and equality for Black, Indigenous people of color?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to try to point to some stories again, because I think that the true evidence of this is what's happening and not what people say, but what people do at the end of the day. And I'll say this about theology too. I do think that in this space, it may be that this is what we find, is that we find that the relationships, building those relationships lead, and then that sort of moves people to a different place. And then the work of theology happens to kind of like figure out, okay, so we feel like we've been led here. How do we do the constructive work and reform really our theology in a way that is now consistent with this new understanding that we have of who we are and how we're in relationship with our fellow African Americans if we're white Christians. But two stories real quickly. One is, and these are kind of stories of hopefulness, I think, of where I see some change. I think it's hard to see that sometimes. A lot of times when we see on the news is the worst of things that are destructive or violent, but we miss, I think, sometimes the good news stories here. So just two that have to do with white Christians in the country. One is from my home state of Mississippi. I'll say, so again, I turned the book manuscript in about a year ago. Both of these stories I'm about to tell are things I would not have imagined were actually happening in the world when I closed the manuscript out. But the first one is that in my home state of Mississippi, the state has voted to remove the Confederate battle flag from its official state flag. Again, this was up for a vote like about 19 years ago, I think, in the state. It was overwhelmingly rejected by most of our white Christian voters in the state of Mississippi. But this time around, something different happened, and that is that the Mississippi Baptist Convention, which is the state arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, and again, this is the convention, my home denomination growing up, that was formed explicitly to allow and to justify Christians owning other human beings and to have that be consistent with the gospel. So that's the history of this of our denomination, and yet the Mississippi Baptists held the press conference and called on the governor and the legislature to remove the Confederate battle flag because it was a divisive and racist symbol. That's like tremendous difference from just 2 decades ago, and something, again, if you had asked me about to predict whether that was going to happen, there's no way I would have bet on that. And the other thing is, I spent some time in Richmond and doing research on the book. And if you walk down Monument Avenue in Richmond, there are these 5 massive Confederate statues in these traffic circles as you kind of head west out of town. You know, they've been there for, most of them were put up in the early 1900s. So they've been there about 100 years. And they were all still standing. You know, just a year ago when I was doing the book research, the statues at the heart of all those monuments are now all gone but one, and it's only there because it's tangled up in some legal wranglings, the statute of Robert E. Lee, about who has the rights to remove it. But I think it's just a matter of when and not if that statue is going to be removed. The monuments themselves are spray painted with Black Lives Matter, you know, slogans. So it's a very different landscape than it was. And when the Andrew Jackson monument was removed, it's right there on a traffic circle, and right across from it is First Baptist Church of Richmond, which is a predominantly white church that in fact moved itself there in the 1920s to be nearer that Confederate monument. It was a kind of a very deliberate move to be near these monuments. And yet, here on as that statue was being removed, that church rang its bells celebrating the removal of that statue. And I did a little digging. It turns out that bell was well over 150 years old, and that the church, which is also very old, actually offered that bell up to the Confederate Army to be melted down to create cannons. During the Civil War, they told them they didn't need it, so they got to keep the bell. But seeing this arc, right, of this bell that a white Christian church offered to the Confederacy to build weapons, to kill people, to defend the right to own other human beings, right, all in the name of Christianity, has now come to a place where they are ringing the bell in celebration of the removal of a Confederate statue that they originally supported. I think, again, that's an arc, I think, that shows that there's at least some movement happening and a different kind of conversation than there was even, you know, 6 or 8 months ago.
Thank you for that. I think kind of following up, Naya asked, in America, why do you think there's not an extension of the Black Lives Matter movement taking place within kind of the larger white Christian churches today, when it has a direct correlation to the legacy of white supremacy? So you just pointed out how there is certainly support, you know, from individual churches, but just thinking about that larger, as we look at the Black Lives Matter movement being in response, a direct challenge to the idea of white supremacy.
Yeah, well, here too, I think there's a real difference. You know, when Black Lives Matter movement erupted on the scene, you know, in a kind of a national sense 5-6 years ago, I know, you know, you just hear, so I'm in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. So we're not the deep South, but still pretty Southern in culture. And, you know, there were a couple of churches here that were predominantly white churches that put up Black Lives Matter signs that were vandalized, they were burned, they were torn down. We've not seen much of that at all this time around. So I think there's more signs, and I think there's been less of that kind of resistance and vandalism. We've had, for example, the J.D. Greer, who's the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, has actually, you know, this time around, again, different than 5 years ago, come out and said, look, white Christians should not like flinch about saying Black Lives Matter. That's something we should all affirm. Again, you know, that wasn't language we were hearing 5 years ago. So could there be more of it? Yes, I think absolutely. But I would say that there's been a significant number of churches they're predominantly white. I got a letter after the book came out from a woman who said she was in her 70s, She's in a small one red light town in Southern Illinois, right in the middle of a cornfield. And she said, you know, I just want you to know, like, me and my 10 other 70-year-old white women are sitting in our one red light stoplight. Our church is right there. We're sitting on the corner in our lawn chairs with our Black Lives Matter signs every Saturday morning, you know, in this very small, predominantly white town. So I think there's more of it happening than it may seem like is happening. I certainly there could be more, but I'm at least encouraged in seeing that people are taking it up and being at least less defensive than they were even 5 years ago.
Thank you. I'm going to continue down this line of questioning here. This question is from Chloe, and they ask, when so much of our country's past is riddled with racist undertones, and that intersects clearly with religion, how do we separate patriotism for America and being a religious American from bigotry?
Yeah, really tricky, right? I mean, you know, I would say that, you know, one of the things that is, I mean, I'm kind of struck. I mean, we have more partisan polarization than we have ever had by any measure that we have as social scientists to measure it. It's very, very clear and very, very palpable. But what's, I think, remarkable that I think we're just getting our heads around is, you know, we're actually no longer debating primarily about issues. That's not the big dividing line between the parties. For the most part, the dividing line is over different visions of America, and I think particularly that term, America, like who gets to be American, who is American, authentically American, and it's that question of inclusion and exclusion, I think, that is really the big divider in the country. And one of the biggest reasons is that why now? Like why is it erupting now? One of the biggest reasons is that we are on this. Is really what my previous book, The End of White Christian America, was about, is that we're on this kind of hinge, this historical hinge, where we have crossed this threshold just in the last 10 years of being a country 10 years ago that was predominantly white and Christian, majority white and Christian, demographically speaking, to one that's no longer majority white and Christian. So the numbers have been, if you go back to 2008, the country was 54% white and Christian. Today, that number is 44. Right, so we've crossed this threshold of majority to non-majority, and it has really put the question forward. Then I think one of the biggest challenges is that we, I say we here because I'm a part of this group, we white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians have felt that we owned the country. We have felt that we were the country, right? And that one of the things that's becoming apparent here is that as the country is changing demographically, those claims are no longer tenable. I mean, they were always a bit false and always exaggerated and always, you know, really a kind of immoral claim to power and dominance. But with the country changing, they just become untenable. And so then the question is, how then do white Christians kind of let go of this really dominant, you know, this need to kind of claim dominant status? And really, I've described it as a table, right? That I think the way that white Christians have been accustomed to being in the country is we own the table, we're sitting at the head of the table, and we're going to invite other people when we feel generous to come up and join us at the table, right? But I think we're finding ourselves in this situation where no one owns the table, right, anymore. And white Christians are being called on to kind of pull up a chair alongside other people, and not at the head, but on equal terms. And I think that's a new experience for many white Christians, and it's a deeply uncomfortable one. But you know, I'm hopeful that it's a transition that white Christians will be able, willing, and actually will embrace.
Thank you. A question from Emma that expands this out beyond just kind of looking at white Christian Americans. But her question is, if this interpretation of white supremacy from the Bible is actually unique to the US. Do we see it in other countries, particularly when we look at the relationship and the length of time of slavery in other countries?
No, it's much deeper. I mean, it goes down into the deep taproot of Christianity global, right? So, you know, one just easy place to point to, in 1493, there was an official edict from the Catholic Catholic Pope, and I should say in 1493, there were no Protestants, right? This is before the Catholic Protestant split. So this is kind of the main branch of Christianity here that was called the Doctrine of Discovery. And what the Doctrine of Discovery said is that it became official Christian teaching that any Christians who were exploring and encountered other lands that were inhabited by non-Christian people, that they were justified in seizing those lands and dominating those people, taking control of the people in the lands in the name of Christianity, in the name of converting them to Christianity and claiming the lands for Christian countries. So this is, it's like 500 years ago, and it's deeply, it informs the kind of what we sometimes learned, as the age of exploration, right? The age of exploration was also the age of white Christian domination, because it was fueled by an official Christian doctrine that was just widely shared by Western European Christians.
This question is from Alex, and I'm gonna see if I can merge it here. But this is after reading chapter 3 and White Too Long. Alex writes, you discuss the white Christian's worldview and its relationship with the Bible's white supremacist interpretation. And then it's later discussed in the chapter that white Christians should avoid making proclamations about what they believe the Bible teaches. How do we resolve this issue? And specifically, how do we think about this with consideration of the likelihood that white Christians and Black Christians hold different views of the Bible? How do we compromise? How do we find the middle in between those views?
Yeah. Well, in that the last piece, and I'll kind of take the thornier piece of this, but the last piece I think is not as hard. I think we find that I'm not sure it's a middle, but I think we find some resonance with each other through relationships, and kind of going to go back to that. I mean, it really is going to have to be built on relationships over time. That'll, I think, be the thing that allows some meeting of the minds. There's certainly no doubt that if you took, I kind of said this in our earlier discussion, if you take, if you listen to an average white pastor for a year and you highlighted every passage in the Bible they preach from, and you listen to an average African-American pastor for a year and you highlight every passage they preach from, you're going to be seeing very different highlighted passages in the book. Much more prophets, Exodus, among African-American pastors, much more salvation and individual kind of sin sorts of things from most white Christian pastors. So I think there is that different approach here. What was it? Read that first part again. There was something in the first part I wanted to make sure I responded to.
Let me go back to it. Let's see. You discussed the white Christian's worldview and the relationship with the Bible's white supremacy interpretation. It's later discussed in the chapter that white Christians should avoid making proclamations about what they believe the Bible teaches.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to explain what I mean there. That comment was really about humility. And one of the things that I think I find troubling as someone who's white and Christian and has really trying to take this history seriously is, I think, particularly I think white evangelical Christians are prone to making very flat-footed announcements about what the Bible teaches, what the biblical worldview is, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if you read the larger passage from where I say that, I mean, one of the things I'm saying is that on the issue of race and racial justice, having gotten this history so wrong so many times, what I'm kind of calling on white Christians to do is that even if, let's just take the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests for racial justice this summer, even if white Christians sort of look at that and don't get it, right? They kind of look at it and say, I don't get what's going on here. This doesn't make sense to me. I feel like we really ought to be paying more attention to the police than to the people who are being shot. We ought to support the police, even if that's the initial reaction and there's a kind of defensiveness there. One of the things I was calling on there is really for white Christians to just have enough humility to hit the pause button, right? Before we go declaring what is right, what is wrong, what the Bible teaches about race, what the biblical worldview is, because we have done that pronouncement, and the things that we filled in the blank on that in the era of segregation or in the era of slavery are appalling. They're appalling and embarrassing, right, from our current worldview. And if we take that seriously, do we really want to repeat those mistakes, right? I think we should just sit with it long enough, and we should have some conversations, right? And what we might find is the thing that looks mysterious and ridiculous to us at first glance is rooted in our own defensiveness, right? And that if we take enough time to sit with it, and again, to have some conversations and to kind of let what we hear, if we really are hearing, and again, if we're in relationship with people who are telling us they're in pain, they're angry, and they're kind of in anguish. I mean, the response to that is not disdain and arrogance. The response to that, when you're in relationship with somebody, is to say, well, tell me about that, right? Tell me about that. Let me understand what you're doing. And I think that changes that's the whole ball game, right? It really changes the landscape.
Thank you. So this is going to be the last question. And boy, did I save the best one for last. This is a big one to jump into, but one I think that is on the minds of a lot of people, given the fact that we have an election next week. What impact do you think the re-election of Donald Trump would have on the ability of white Christians, ability or inability, to respond to and eradicate the white supremacy rooted in this religion?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult, and I'm hearing this from many African Americans. It's going to be very difficult for building those relationships because it's going to be tough. The thing that should be, I think, a great scandal. I mentioned H. Richard Niebuhr earlier, but he also wrote this book called The Social Sources of Denominationalism, where he talked about the scandal, or that he basically said it should be a scandal. The racial divides within the Christian church should be a scandal. Now, we're so accustomed to living with them that I think we just don't wrestle with them sufficiently. But in our latest survey that we released this past week, for example, we have no groups further apart than Black and white Christians on the question of the election, right? So we have about 8 in 10 white evangelicals, in particular. I should say no groups further apart than white evangelical Christians and African American Protestant Christians. We have 8 in 10 white evangelical Christians saying they're going to support Trump, and we have 9 in 10 African Americans saying they're going to support Joe Biden. Right? So you can't get much further apart than that. I think we really ought to interrogate, and I would say we white Christians really ought to think about, like, what does that mean, right? That we say we share the same gospel, we worship the same God, we read the same Bible, and yet we end up in such drastically different places on these questions. And then, I'll say, here that I think it's just clear many of the comments that the current president has made are just racist. I think we have to be willing to say that. I mean, when he says, when he's tweeting to say, look, white suburban women, I'm going to protect you from low-income housing coming to your neighborhood, and Cory Booker, who, by the way, happens to be an African-American, young African-American politician, is going to be the person responsible for invading your neighborhoods. That language, to be really straightforward about it, is the language of lynching. It is the threat to white women of Black men. That is the kind of logic of lynching that's right there in front of us. To refuse to denounce white supremacists. I mean, any politician, independent, Democrat, Republican, we ought to all call them out when they refuse to condemn white supremacists, which President Trump has now done twice, several years apart, once after Charlottesville and once in the debates here. And we're at a point where we have 6 in 10 Americans today are concerned and believe that President Trump is encouraging white supremacist groups. 6 in 10 Americans say that today. So I think we've got a real challenge here because President Trump himself has put the issue of race and particularly systemic racism on the ballot and right in front of us. So I think it makes it very, very difficult when we're trying to have civil conversations about this, that it's wrapped up in these partisan divides that just pour fuel in the fire and make a civil conversation very, very difficult.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you have any last words that you would like to leave us with?
Well, just again, thank you for the conversation. I think it's really important. The other thing I should say, I guess the last word is, I do think that young people have a huge role to play here. And it is a problem that has been kicked down the road by us older white Christians. I think at the end of the day, like we need your help. I think it is kind of this younger generation who already have the relationships I've been talking about, are much more likely to be in relationship with somebody of a different race than older Americans are. I think the marches, the attention, the insistence that this is an issue that we are not going to just keep ignoring, that we're finally going to address. I think holding our feet to the fire. And at the end of the day, again, we do this because we want a healthier country and we want a healthier faith at the end of the day. And that's what it's ultimately in the service of.
So thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Thank you, Dr. Longmire-Avital, and thank you, Dr. Blake. And on behalf of all the co-sponsors, we are so delighted to have hosted this event. And thank you to all of you all who joined us this evening. So thank you very much, Dr. Jones.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones.